Hello, my name is Charlotte Goodwin, and today I'm going to read you the third chapter of my debut novel, The General's Son. Just as a reminder, if you still want to catch up on chapters 1 and 2, you can find all the chapters that I've recorded to date on my YouTube channel, which is The Gallantrian Legacy. Okay, right, I'm going to get started with chapter 3. So, the location is the Timor Sea off the north coast of Australia, and we're back on Earth, which is planet B13536. It was Aaron's third day at sea, and he was sick of the incessant bobbing already. He had no idea how he'd tolerated weeks at sea when he was in Fantasia, where the ships were driven by the fickle wind and some journeys could take months. There were certainly a lot of modern conveniences on Earth he'd taken a liking to. Rapid travel was just one of them. There were no flights to Australia. The international airlines stopped flying there after China's attack. The nukes came first. The smaller missiles followed, targeted to finish off what remained of the military and any remaining shreds of governance. After that, the country descended into lawlessness. Without a government, or even any senior military commanders left alive, the criminals took over, and it became a land where the warlords and the drug barons ruled. Every self-respecting citizen who'd survived the attacks fled, most to New Zealand, the only country who opened its doors to the refugees. Now the only way to get to Australia was by sea. Aaron managed to find a fisherman from East Timor to take him to Australia. It had taken years, and he'd spent thousands on travel before he'd managed to get a clear idea of where the magical tingling was coming from. He'd confirmed it was from the east early on. He'd flown to Indonesia, and from there the magic felt stronger to the southeast. He'd edged ever closer to Australia until he was satisfied that his suspicions had been correct. The nukes landed, the tingling surged, and he was now in no doubt that the bombs had triggered something. More magic had been released by the blast. He was sure of it, and now he sailed across the Timor Sea, tracking the magical currents towards their source. He'd become a master of tracing the magic. He'd spent hours in meditation, concentrating and focusing on the power. He had become so good at sensing even the faint, tiniest field of magic, he could almost see it. And as the shore of the city of Darwin came into view, he'd never been more sure he was on the right track. He let the waves of energy flow into him, butterflies of tingling excitement fluttering through his body as he felt his power grow. The engine cut out and the boat bobbed to a halt. "We're at the end," the captain of the boat called down from Aaron behind the wheel in broken English. "We here. We at Darwin." Aaron snapped. "It's miles away. Why have you stopped? Take me to the shore," he demanded. "Too dangerous. Criminals. We stay here. You swim." "I can't swim that far. You have to take me, or give me your small boat. I can sail it to the shore." He pointed to the motorized dinghy resting on the stern. "No, if you want boat, you pay extra. No way to get it back. Dinghy expensive." As Aaron ground his teeth, he felt the creeping prickle of surging magic. "I paid you to take me to Darwin," he growled. "Take me to shore, or you will regret it," his fingers curling into squeezing fists. The fisherman's two crew members emerged from below decks and sauntered towards their captain's side. They had knives strapped to their belts and the strong physiques of men used to manual work. Aaron was lean and unarmed. "What you going to do?" the captain laughed. "Throw us into the sea? You, skinny man?" He continued to laugh. The other crew members laughed with him. Aaron could feel the magic surge. He said nothing and let their laughter antagonize him as he reached for the flood of power. He let his rage fuel its strength. It rushed into his being and pulsed through his veins. He gripped it with his mind and let it pool in his chest. Aaron raised his hands. He let his power flow. It shot along his arms like a bolt from a crossbow, flew from his fingers and sped towards the men. He clung to the tendrils of power as they spun through the air. He whipped his hands to the sides and forced a thrusting squall across the polished deck. Not quite as strong as he'd hoped, but good enough. The crew were lifted from their feet and hurled sideways, taken by the sudden gust and shoved into the railings. The wind kept coming. The railings didn't hold them. The blast was too powerful and the men were forced outwards, legs flipping as they pivoted over the railings. The three of them fell headfirst towards the sea. The release of power swept through Aaron's being with euphoric vigour. It felt incredible. He was panting, gasping through grinning teeth as he heard the splash, saw the spray, and rushed to see them bob to the surface. They yelled and they swam. The ladder was close. He didn't have much time. He rushed to the helm, turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. The water gurgled, and as the propeller spun and the boat began to move, the sailor screamed. But Aaron smiled as their shouts were drowned out by the hum of the boat and the roar of the waves. Darwin was the biggest Australian city that hadn't been destroyed by China. It had become its de facto capital. It was run by a drugs baron named Nickel. Darwin was a major trading hub for the export of narcotics, and Nickel controlled the trade. No one got in and out of the seaport without the baron or his people knowing about it. No one escaped the taxes. Aaron wasn't far from the port when the two speedboats sailed out to flank him. Each was crewed by 4 men and women, all of them armed. AK-47s were aimed straight at Aaron. "Stop the boat!" The order was shouted through a megaphone. Aaron complied. "How many on board?" Aaron left the helm and walked towards the railings, clutching the wire barrier and facing the boat bobbing at his starboard side. "Just me. I'm alone." "What's your business in Darwin?" "Trade. I have phones to sell." Aaron had brought several holders of the latest mobile phones with him. He knew he had to have a cover story to take him to Australia without suspicion. "Phones? What types? iPhones? Samsung?" "I have a mixture. The latest models. Satellite capable. No need for masts. Just what you need out here." The man with the megaphone grinned and whispered something frantically at the woman next to him, who still aimed at Aaron. "Throw a couple down and let's call it the down payment on your import duty. Got any iPhone 21s? He called. "I've got a few of those. Let me find some." He turned to fetch the phones. "Hang on there, mate. We're not going to let you head off below decks." The man in the boat interrupted. "Someone's got to keep an eye on you. If you give us a couple of iPhones, we'll let you through. But first, we need to do a boat inspection to make sure you're on your own, as you say, and everything's in order." His boat was searched by 2 armed guards. They found nothing of concern. The belongings of the missing crew was of no interest to them. After parting with a phone for every one of the 8 guards, he was allowed to clumsily manoeuvre the small fishing boat into the harbour. The docking fee was huge, far higher than expected, but he didn't care. He let them take the boat. He wasn't going to need it again. He grabbed his phones and his luggage and ventured ashore. Before the attack on Australia, Darwin's port was tiny. It had a marina and a small ferry port, but it had never been a trading hub. Now things were different. The city had ballooned in size. It was a long way from the fallout zones of the east and the west coasts, and refugees had flooded into the city. It had also become the centre of the drugs trade. The manufacturing of crack cocaine, crystal meths, and ecstasy were the main drivers of the local economy. And desperate refugees were employed in the factories. It had rapidly become the drugs capital of the world. Aaron wobbled down the floating jetty, past the luxurious super yachts swarming with armed guards, dilapidating fishing boats and ragged crews, and speedboats with shifty men loading taped-up boxes. He edged towards the shore, arms aching under the strain of the holdalls, past dirty children who dangled makeshift fishing rods in the water, and the characters who loitered by the sea wall, watching, keeping an eye on God knows what. A group of armed men strutted past, rifles slung on their backs, pistols at their hips. Almost everyone was armed here, some more heavily than others. His feet made solid ground at the edge of the harbour. It was a bustling sea of traders and stalls. Buyers and sellers of anything imaginable waited for boats to dock, a convenient market for his phones. He knew they made him a target, and he had no wish to hang on to them longer than he had to. He was sauntering along the walkway, scanning the stalls, when a man came from nowhere and put an arm on his shoulder. "I hear you have phones. The latest models. You got a buy yet?" If not, I'm more than happy to take them off your hands. How about you step this way, into my office?" Aaron scowled at the podgy finger as the podgy fingers settled on his t-shirt and followed them to his plump face. Greasy hair dangled into his creased clothes, but men were more than their looks alone, and this man was a genuine trader. His instincts, helped by a little bit of magic, told him that. The man led him into a rickety shack. "Take a seat, please." The podgy man gestured towards a plastic chair. Aaron unslung his rucksack from his shoulders and dumped his holdalls on the floor. "So how many you got? Both those holdalls filled with them, are they?" Aaron nodded. "What makes you got? How about you get 'em out so I can have a look?" Aaron was happy to comply. He wasn't bothered about getting a good price, he just wanted rid. After the sale of the lodge and the private game reserve, even after the debts were paid, he'd enough money to keep him going for some time. It wasn't his money, but he'd taken it anyway. It should have been split between his mother and his two surviving uncles, but they didn't deserve it. It was he who had seen the lodge out into its final days, he who had kept it going after he had been forced into management. He was owed what money was left, so he took it and fled the country. No one would find him in Australia. Here he could disappear and build a new life. He took out a few samples from his holdall. "I have the latest Samsungs, iPhones and Sonys. Just the three makes, but satellite ready and SIM card free. I have 50 each of the Samsungs and Sonys and 42 of the iPhones. That's 142 in total. Shall we say $150,000 for the lot?" It was a high opening price, but tech was expensive in the failed state. There was no functioning government. All imports were done via black market trade routes or individual entrepreneurs. People similar to who Aaron was pretending to be, who brought in goods from overseas hoping to make a quick buck. They negotiated. Aaron let his price fall until they had an agreement. "Great doing business." The podgy man shook his hand and checked through his merchandise. "You heading off? Or do you plan to find some exports to take with you first?" The man raised an eyebrow. Drugs and anything salvaged from the nuclear wastelands on the east and west coast were the only exports from Australia. "If you do, I can put you in touch with some people. I've lots of contacts. Don't deal in that stuff myself like, but for those with a head for it." "No, thank you," Aaron cut him off. "I'm going to stay here for a while. I'm going to head south. Do you know where I can get a car? A good one? A 4x4 maybe?" "You going to stay? Through choice?" The podgy man looked baffled. "No one comes to Australia from the outside to stay, unless they're running." He tilted his head questioningly. "I'm not running, I'm searching. There's something in the south I want to try and find." "How far are you heading?" "It can be sketchy too far from Darwin, out in the desert. The land is even more uncivilized than here. In the city, Nick'll keep things mostly quiet." "I don't know how far. I'm not sure yet." "You got a gun?" "No." "You should get one, and sleep with one eye open." "I don't need a gun." The trader looked Aaron up and down. His slight build was easily betrayed by his loose t-shirt and cotton trousers. He wasn't even especially tall. He was of medium height and looked like he'd never lifted anything heavier than the holdalls he'd carried ashore in his entire life. "You good at kung fu? And know how to dodge bullets?" "I can take care of myself." "Even those who have a gun and know how to use it don't travel too far south alone. If you want to live, I suggest you find someone to watch your back." Aaron considered his words. The man might have a point. "And where would I find someone I can trust?" "Try Shenanigans. Irish pub. Every place has one, right? Even here. These days it's a hub for hired muscle. If you go in, ask at the bar for Sammy and tell him Ryan sent you. Thanks for the tip. Any ideas on where to get that car?" "I'd find your muscle first. They may have a ride of their own. Might save you a few dollars unless your heart's set on buying one." With the cash for the phones transferred safely into Aaron's account, he ventured out of the harbour and into the city in search of the pub Ryan had mentioned. He carried just his rucksack. He didn't have much with him. When he was royalty, he had servants who packed everything for him and transported it on his behalf whenever he travelled. Without such luxuries, he'd learnt to travel light. The less you carried, the less there was to worry about. On the tropical coast of northern Australia, the air hung in a humid mist of enveloping haze. Aaron was used to the heat, but the humidity here was oppressive. Away from the sea breeze, the sweat was soon trickling down his back, his clothes sticking to his skin, and a ragged thirst gripping his throat. He stopped to get a water bottle out of his pack. A young woman approached. "Hey there, stranger. You looking for a good time?" Aaron glanced up from his rucksack. The woman was young, perhaps in her late teens, and she was wearing almost nothing. Some slithers of fabric covered the essential parts, and heavy makeup was plastered across her youthful face. Somehow, she looked neat and fresh despite the heat. "No, thank you." Her breast bulged around the fabric strips. Her curvaceous but slender form drew Aaron's eyes. He was tempted. No, he would not pay for sex. If he wanted it, he'd just take it. And this woman probably had a pimp nearby. He did not want to attract attention. He slung his rucksack back on his shoulder and continued back down the street. Trees lined the road, their branches trailing onto the pavement. Long grass dotted with litter grew around their trunks. Stinking black bags sat in piles in the shade of the leaves. A burnt-out car rusted in the sun. Its bumper was still wrapped around the tree it had collided with. Past the trees and towards the city, tall buildings with broken windows and graffiti-covered lower floors towered above. Thick steel gates guarded the doors of stone office buildings, and bars protected the windows. The few pedestrians looked broken or shifty. Gangs of youths loitered menacingly in the shade. The unmistakable aroma of cannabis drifted through the air. Aaron kept himself to himself as he continued down the street, trying not to attract attention. As he passed into the city centre, the shops became more numerous, but not a single one looked like it welcomed customers. Some had armed guards by the entrance. Others, heavy gates and an intercom system. And yet he'd been told this was one of the safer parts of Australia. Shenanigans was not hard to find. It was straight down the high street. Ryan's directions were easy enough to follow. He was greeted by a large guard at the door, who grinned down at Aaron, a cigar held in his teeth and a rifle in his hands. "Any guns, any blades?" he said with a snigger. Aaron knew he didn't look the type. He suspected he looked more akin to a lost tourist than the normal clientele of a bar. "No." "Scan him," the guard said to his colleague, who had emerged from the shadows, his rifle slung on his back and a metal detector in his hand. "Drop the bag, mate. Let's have a look," the second guard said in a surprisingly friendly tone. Aaron did as instructed. The guard scanned it. The detector barely beeped. The bag mostly had clothes in it. The only metal he could think of in there were the blades on his razor. The detector was run over Aaron too, before he was allowed to enter the gloomy bar. He pushed through the door into a wave of cool. The air conditioning was heavenly, but it did nothing for the smell. Sweat mixed with spilt beer. Smoke from the cigarettes choked his lungs and stung his eyes. The floor was hard stone, but his feet stuck to it as he walked. He headed towards the bar, weaving through the mass of large men and mean-looking women to try to get to the front. A voluptuous barmaid with a low-cut top, big eyes and a cascading blonde hair beamed at him. "What can I get you?" Her white teeth sparkled as she spoke. "A glass of Coke, please. And is Sammy here?" Her brows lifted and her bemused face looked Aaron up and down. "A man like you might need someone like Sammy. He's here. How about I get you that Coke and I'll let him know you're asking for him?" she said with a wink. He sipped his drink and waited amongst a chorus of musical Australian accents, pulling his elbows in and propping them on the bar as he tried to make himself small and keep the crowds from nudging him. He was slowly getting irritated as the minute ticked by. There was barely any room to move, yet somehow the crowd seemed to part as a short, slim, clean-shaven man with waxed hair swaggered towards the bar. He found a stool and pulled one up next to Aaron. "You're asking for me?" the man said with a smile. "You're Sammy?" he asked incredulously. Somehow he was expecting someone bigger. "That's me," he said with a nod. "How can I help?" Ryan sent me," he began hesitantly. "You're not from round here, are you?" Sammy tilted his head to one side. "Your accent is strange. It's a little African, but different somehow. Where are you from?" The man was still smiling, and his friendly face was managing to cut through Aaron's doubts. "I'm from Kenya." "Kenya? And you've come all the way over here?" "I won't ask you what brought you. People travel for all kinds of reasons, especially to places like this. But if you're in shenanigans and asking for me, it is only for one reason. How many men do you need?" By the end of the chat, Aaron found himself liking Sammy, despite himself. He's one of those infuriating people who everyone just warms to, and even Aaron was not immune to natural charm. Despite appearances, the man certainly seemed to know his business, though, and he said he knew just the man for the job. And he was in luck. That man happened to be at the other end of the bar. Fred was everything Aaron expected a hired thug to be. He was tall, built like a brick shithouse, and looked like he'd been in more than a few fights. His disjointed nose told of multiple breakages. The sag in his left eyebrow drew attention to the thick scar running above the eye socket. The sleeves on his black t-shirt were tight on his bulging biceps and bloated belly. The man made Aaron feel tiny in comparison. He looked perfect. Sammy had introduced them. Aaron grilled him until he was content the man wouldn't kill him in his sleep, hack his phone, and steal his wealth. It didn't take much magic to check whether someone was telling the truth. Satisfied, he paid Sammy the broker fee and took Fred into his employ. Fred didn't have a car of his own, but he helped Aaron buy one. They sorted it the next day and got on the road and headed south. They'd been driving for hours, and barely a word passed between them. Fred wasn't much of a conversationalist, which suited him fine. Aaron had nothing to say either. He sat and let his hired help drive the truck as he stared out of the window. He barely noticed as the farms became forests and the forests became desert. He didn't see the trees or shrubs, the passing cars or the bright blue sky. He stared at magic. After years of searching for it, scraping to grasp hold of every last wisp of the rare threads of energy, so faint they were almost undetectable, he could now see it. Like a blind person who learns to see using their hands, Aaron could see magic with his eyes. The faint lines wove through the air, spinning and swirling. They wrapped around all living things. They were drawn to the trees and birds. Even Fred was encircled by the faint wisps of light. He'd never been able to see magic in Fantasia. He'd never needed to. But now he knew that should he return, the world would be lit up to him as clear as day, even on the darkest nights. The magic on Earth was nothing compared to the magic he knew existed on his home planet. As the truck rumbled down the never-ending road, Aaron dreamed of home. "We're going to have to stop shortly. The truck's running low on gas," Fred informed Aaron, breaking the long silence and pulling Aaron from his trance. "Fine," he snapped grumpily. "Do you know if there's a gas station nearby?" "We're not far from Danston. There was a sign not far back. We could fuel up there." Danston was a small town in the midst of the desert that once survived on passing trade from the highway. Few travelled in and out of the desert these days. Only the drug runners and anyone who wanted to live far from anyone else passed through these parts. Piles of rubbish and burnt-out cars marked the outskirts of Danston. Windows were boarded in a futile attempt to protect homes from intruders, but their owners would never return to find their front doors prized open, and everything of value gone. Dusty gardens with the skeletons of plants inside were graveyards of the homes they mourned. The desert slowly reclaimed its land. Yet the gas station survived, a lonely monument to the town that was. People still travelled. Cars still needed fuel. Electric cars would be useless here. Between power cuts and trashed infrastructure, any electric car would be out of power long before there was somewhere to charge it on the road that crossed a continent. The place seemed quiet. The hum of a generator and an illuminated open sign betrayed the life existing here. Fred pulled up at a pump and honked his horn. A woman of middling years with a spare weight at her hips wobbled out of the shop and meandered towards the car. "Philip, is it?" she called as she approached. "Yep," Fred replied. "It's $5.23 a litre, the woman chirped, "and payments in advance. You taking just enough for your tank, or some containers beside?" Aaron balked at the price. It was a couple of dollars cheaper in Darwin. Why hadn't Fred suggested they take some extra cans of fuel? He didn't say anything. He just sat and scowled and nodded. Their truck was fueled, and Fred went into the shop for a piss and to buy a few supplies, while Aaron stayed with the vehicle. Fred advised it wasn't safe to leave it alone, despite the apparent emptiness of the place. He said there were more folk than you might think lurking in the unloved buildings. He was right. Aaron sat alone, trying not to fume at the fuel prices, trying to enjoy the sight of the magic once more, when two men and a woman emerged from somewhere. He saw the swirls of magic that rippled around them as they strolled into view. He saw it concentrate around their bodies, yet they both held something in their hands that looked inorganic. It barely attracted any power, but whatever it was, They were pointing each of their objects right at him. He shook his head vigorously. He knew what it was. One man and one woman were pointing rifles at his face. Another man knocked on his window. Aaron lowered it. A man in his 30s with a missing tooth, a crooked nose, and a close-cut hair grinned at him. "Now, matey, how about you hand over the keys and there'll be no need for any trouble?" Aaron glared at him. The man's grin dropped. "Come on, there's no need to be stubborn." Aaron glanced at the shop, looking for Fred. The man tracked his gaze. "There's no point looking for your friend. He's having trouble getting out of the gents. You're alone here. You, your truck, and the three of us. Get your skinny ass out of the truck, and we can all live to see another day." Aaron still didn't answer. He fed his anger and concentrated on the magic, drawing the swirls to him. They drifted through the air, and he pulled them into his chest. The magic was stronger here, stronger than in Darwin, and it dwarfed the magic in Kenya. He concentrated. He let it build. "Last chance, mate. Get out of the truck or I'll put a bullet in your head." The man pulled out a pistol and pointed it straight at Aaron. Aaron lifted his hands, appearing to surrender. He had other plans. He let out a steady breath, let his power flow, and sent it streaming through his palms. It shot towards a pistol and the two rifles. They glowed hot with energy. "Ah!" the man yelled, hands shaking furiously as his gun tumbled to the ground. A wave of fatigue washed over Aaron. The power he'd expended heating the guns had been more than he'd expected. He was growing wary already. When the angry carjackers ran towards his truck, he had few options. He wanted to do something dramatic. He wanted to show them what he could do. But he didn't have the power. Not here. Not on Earth. A simple spell would have to do. He lifted his hands and let the magic he'd left gush towards the three of them. It wrapped around their heads and sucked their conscious minds into resting slumber. Their eyes drooped. Feet staggered. Legs sagged. Torsos collapsed into the dust. Their chests heaved with tiny gasps and whistling snores. Aaron sat in silence, drained and angry, frustrated that he had done little, that his foes still lived. He was considering getting his knife and slitting their throats when a rhythmic pounding caught his ear. It was coming from the shop. Bang, bang, crash! Something gave, collided with the shelving unit, and store goods scattered to the ground. Fred came running out of the shop. He halted in his tracks, stared at the two men and one woman who lay on the ground, their weapons not far away. What the fuck happened here? So that's the end of chapter 3. I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully you now want to listen to chapter 4. That'll be released in another week's time, as will every subsequent chapter over the coming year. If you want to keep up to date with when they're all going to be released, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel, The Gallantrian Legacy. And of course, as ever, for all details about my books, the series, and anything else, please check out my website, charlottegoodwin.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Bye.